The first time they found her cabin, half sunk into the earth like it was ashamed of itself, the chimney wasn't smoking. Not even a thread of heat escaped. The snow had piled nearly up to the eaves, and it was so cold that two of the ranch hands refused to get off their horses. "Ain't nobody's living in that," one of them muttered, pulling his scarf tighter. But old Luke Taylor didn't say a word. He just stared hard at the place, his eyes tracking the ridgeline of packed soil around the walls, the shuttered windows that looked more like gun slits, the way the smoke hole had been plugged with what looked like a stone slab sealed in mud. And then the door creaked open. The widow stepped out, cheeks flushed with warmth, her breath a soft mist against the icy dawn. She didn't even shiver. Her dress sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hands red from kneading dough in a bowl she carried. And behind her, in the darkness of that buried cabin, the sound of two children laughing as they argued over something that smelled like soup. The snow was biting cold. The men were wrapped in wool and still couldn't stop their jaws from rattling. But that woman, little Eliza Martin, widowed just last winter, stood there like it was spring inside. Luke stared at her, then at the cabin, then back at her again. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "how in hell are you not freezing to death in there?" And that was the moment the whole valley began to whisper about her so-called Chinese bed stove. Of course, no one really knew what it was yet. They'd only heard rumors, little things. The postmaster's boy swore he saw steam coming out the sides of her floorboards last week. Someone else said she hadn't bought firewood in months. "Witchcraft," one rancher's wife muttered. "Or maybe she's eating coal." But none of them could explain how the woman who once wept at the loss of her husband in last year's blizzard could now smile with red cheeks and warm hands, while the rest of them burned logs faster than they could split them. No one had any answers. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she had built something beneath her bed, something low and quiet and strange, not a stove, not a furnace, something older than the valley, older than any settler's cabin, older even than the trails the Comanche once carved through the hills. She'd dug it herself, and it had changed everything. Eliza hadn't meant to survive that first winter alone, not after Joseph died, with frost in his beard and his body curled like a broken branch near the chimney that never burned hot enough. She buried him under the snow, couldn't even get through the frost to reach dirt, just piled stones around the place his heart stopped beating, and marked it with a little cross carved from a chair leg. She cried for 3 days. The children had stopped asking when Pa would come back. That was the worst part. She lit every fire she could manage, burned the last of the coal Joseph had stashed under the porch, burned the pantry shelves, then the chair legs, then one of her own boots. By late January, they'd been sleeping in a pile on the floor, wrapped in horse blankets, huddled so tight she could feel her son's ribs poking against her belly and hear her daughter's teeth grinding in her sleep. The cold wasn't like knives. It was like slow death, creeping into lungs and joints and even dreams. And then one night, delirious and half-starved, she remembered something Joseph once said, not to her, but to a trapper at the trading post. They'd been drinking cheap whiskey, talking about winters in the Dakotas, and one of the old men mentioned kang beds or kang tang or something like that. Said the Chinese used to sleep on brick platforms heated from underneath by stoves, letting the heat soak right into their bones all night. No wasted smoke, just low, radiant warmth. Joseph had laughed at the idea. "Good for the rice lands," he'd said, "but we're not running no opium dens out here." But Eliza hadn't laughed. Not that night, and not now. She began tearing the house apart in silence. She waited until the kids were asleep, then stayed up moving the bed. She pried up the floorboards, dug a shallow trench where the cold seeped worst. She used Joseph's broken shovel and her bare hands until her knuckles bled. By dawn, she had a space big enough to crawl into. She didn't know what she was building, only that the cold had to stop. At first, it was just a hollow pit, maybe a foot deep. Then she carved a small tunnel under it, leading to the old stove's firebox, angled so smoke wouldn't rise directly under the bed, but could warm the bricks she dragged in from the ruined smokehouse. She used wet clay from the creek bank to seal the gaps, packed it tight with ashes, and flattened it with a timber beam. By the third night, she lit the fire in the stove. The flame roared up for an hour, then she choked it down low, just a flicker, barely enough to keep coals alive, and waited. The floor above the trench grew warm, not hot, not blazing like the chimney flames they'd needed before, but warm enough to keep her hand there, warm enough to make the children sigh in their sleep, warm enough that the frost stopped creeping onto the walls. She lay on the bed with them that night and cried, not from sadness, from relief. They slept warm till morning, and for the first time since Joseph's last breath, Eliza dreamed of spring. She perfected it in silence. Over the next weeks, While neighbors trudged through snow with sleds full of cordwood, Eliza stayed home. She removed the cast-iron stove entirely, using just the fire trench below. She learned to feed the flame through a side hole near the porch, so the heat never left the ground. She learned how to channel it beneath where they slept, then out through a vent in the wall, low and slow like a breath in prayer. She burned less, way less. By her count, 60% less wood. The cabin stayed warm, but not the air, the walls, the floors, the bed itself. The heat lingered in the bricks for hours, even after the fire was dead, and people noticed. They started visiting more. Excuses mostly. Got any bread to trade? Heard your roof didn't cave, just checking on the little ones. But they all lingered too long in the doorway, eyes squinting toward the bed, nostrils flaring at the faint scent of baked clay and steam. No chimney smoke, no roaring fire, and yet warmth. That's when the whispers started, and that's when she knew it wouldn't stay secret forever. The first to accuse her outright was Mabel Dunn, loud woman, owned the dairy east of the pass. She stormed into town, shouting that Eliza was stealing heat from underground, that it wasn't natural, that the devil had taught her something through her husband's ghost. "No woman should sleep without a stove in winter," she bellowed. Eliza said nothing, but others were curious now, some angry, some desperate, and one man, Ephraim Hale, with his frost-bitten fingers and his boy coughing blood, was both. He came to Eliza's door 2 nights later, not with a torch, like Mabel had feared, but with a question. "What is it, ma'am?" he asked. "What are you using?" She looked at his hands, his trembling jaw, the way he couldn't stop glancing at her cabin walls like they might offer answers. And something broke in her. She told him, not all at once, but enough. She drew diagrams in the dirt, showed him the trench, the air channels, the bricks, the clay. "Under the bed?" he asked, stunned. She nodded. "Keeps the body warm from below. Doesn't waste heat on air that don't matter." He stared, then swallowed hard. "Will you help me build one?" Eliza hesitated, then she nodded again. And that was the beginning of what would change the valley forever. What began in desperation, in grief and clay and fire under floorboards, would become something whispered about in every homestead within 20 miles by springtime. But first, they'd have to survive the worst storm yet, and Eliza's hidden stove would be tested like never before. Ephraim Hale came back the next morning with his son bundled in a worn quilt and a shovel still caked with last week's frost. He didn't say much, just looked at Eliza and then at the spot beside her cabin where the snow lay lower, sunken from the heat that bled through the underground walls. His boots crunched up to the porch, his breath steaming, and he asked again, quieter this time, "Show me how deep to dig?" Eliza didn't answer right away. She looked past him at the hills, at the dark line of trees in the distance, at the winter haze that had begun to thicken and settle like a warning. Then she pointed with a stick to the outline she'd drawn the night before, a pit no longer, then a man lying down, but twice as wide. "Bricks here," she told him. "Clay packed tight here. Air vent dug low and long, running out past the foundation. Fire hole lined with rock, mouth facing away from the wind." She didn't waste words. Ephraim didn't ask questions. They worked until dusk. His son, Adam, sat on the porch, bundled like a mummy, cheeks pale, but watching everything, until his eyes drooped and Eliza took him inside and let him lie near the warmest floorboard in the house. "Don't get used to it," she told him. But when she looked at the boy's thin arms and hollow face, she sighed and pressed a mug of broth into his hands. By nightfall, Ephraim's fingers were bloodied, his breath ragged, his back bent like a wet tree limb. But the trench was dug, the first bricks were set, and when he looked up from the shadows of the earth at Eliza's face, smudged with clay and grit, eyes sharp, he didn't speak, only nodded once. It was the most gratitude she'd seen from a man since Joseph died. By the end of that week, 3 more came. Mabel Dunn's husband, sheepish, hat in hand, cheeks ruddy with embarrassment. "The missus don't know I'm here," he muttered. "But she's coughing, and the chimney's cracking worse with every frost. If you'd just show me." He brought eggs, 3, fragile and precious and nearly frozen. Then came Josiah Kirk, teeth chattering, carrying a pail of nails and a bottle of homemade brandy. Said nothing at first, just held out the brandy with both hands like an offering at an altar. Eliza took it, set it on the porch, didn't drink it, but she let him see the fire tunnel anyway. The last was Rebecca Finch. She didn't come for warmth, not at first. She came out of suspicion. She came to spy. Eliza knew it the second she arrived, boots too clean, gloves too fine, eyes too sharp. She stepped into the cabin without asking and looked around like she already knew what was there. "Not a stick of smoke," she said, sniffing the air. "And yet you don't shiver." Eliza watched her with a level gaze. "What you after, Rebecca?" The woman smiled tightly. "Truth." Eliza almost laughed. "There ain't no truth in a valley like this. Just choices, and most of 'em made in the dark." Rebecca didn't reply. But that night, Eliza found a boot print behind her cabin, pressed deep near the air tunnel, half filled with snow. She didn't say anything the next day when Rebecca returned, this time with a satchel and her little sister shivering behind her. "I need your help," she said. Eliza stepped aside and pointed toward the fire pit. They came one by one, with gifts they couldn't afford, and hands cracked from cold and pride half swallowed like bitter medicine. And Eliza taught them, not just how to dig, how to see, how to understand that the heat didn't need to roar, it only needed to linger, how to trap warmth in the ground, in the stone, in the body of the home, not its breath. They worked in silence mostly, dug tunnels through the frost, built beds on bricks, crafted clay vents, and sealed them with ash paste and hope. And slowly, the valley changed. It began in whispers. Heard the widow Martin's stove, don't use no logs. Saw light in Finch's window long past dusk, but no smoke from her flue. Hale's boy is laughing again. Then came the questions, and the doubts, and the fear. Because what Eliza had done, what she'd shared, was not just warmth, it was defiance. Against the cold, against death, against the way things were always done, and not everyone liked that. The preacher spoke out first, Brother Myron, tall and lean, with a voice that carried like wind through bare trees. He stood on his chapel steps one Sunday morning, frost on his collar, and declared it blasphemy. "The Lord gave us fire," he said, "to remind us of heaven and hell, of heat and consequence. You burn too little, you freeze. You burn too much, you suffer. That is the balance. That is the test. This thing under her bed, it is unnatural. It hides from the light, it cheats the test, and the Lord does not bless cheats." Eliza sat in the back pew, silent. Her children fidgeted beside her, and Ephraim Hale stood up slowly and said, "Preacher, if you'd felt your son's bones through his skin, you might thank God for a warm bed, no matter how it got that way." The church went quiet. Brother Myron did not speak again that morning, but the damage was done. A week later, someone smashed the clay vent behind Eliza's cabin. She didn't see who, only found the crumbled bricks scattered like bones in the snow. The children cried that night when the heat didn't hold. Eliza didn't cry. She dug out the trench with her bare hands again, rebuilt the vent, used smoother stone, hid the outlet deeper beneath the porch. She told no one. But when Ephraim came by the next evening and saw the bandages on her fingers, he didn't ask, just left a bundle of cut timber by her door and stood watch until dawn. The storm came mid-February, not just a snow, an ending. Sky turned to ash. The wind howled like a dying choir. The drifts swallowed fences, then porches, then entire walls. Smoke froze in chimneys. Doors cracked from frost. People stayed inside and hoped, but hope was a brittle thing. For many, it was already too late. The cabins with tall stoves fared worst, the kind that needed roaring fire every hour to survive. When the wood ran low, the cold won, fast, without mercy. Eliza's cabin glowed like an ember in the snow. Low light, no smoke. But inside, it was warm. Not hot, never hot, but warm enough that her children played in shirt sleeves. Warm enough that her hands didn't bleed when she washed the dishes. Warm enough that she sang again, under her breath, lullabies she hadn't dared sing since Joseph died. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 4th, there was a knock at the door. It was Thomas Reeve, one of the cattlemen, a loud man, a mean man, a man who'd once mocked her in the trading post for not knowing how to split her own kindling. Now he stood shaking, covered in frost, carrying his youngest daughter wrapped in canvas and tears frozen on his cheeks. "I lost the rest," he said. Eliza let him in. She didn't speak, just pointed to the warm spot near the bricks. He collapsed beside it. The girl didn't cry. She was too far gone for that. But Eliza placed her palms on the child's cheeks, and slowly, the blue faded from her lips. By nightfall, there were 7 people in her cabin. By morning, 11. She moved the children to the bunk, laid wool blankets along the walls, fed the fire tunnel with bark and dry brush, and even pages torn from Joseph's old ledger books. It held, the heat held, and in that little buried cabin, dug low into the earth like a secret, they waited out the storm together. When the thaw came, they emerged like survivors from a sunken world. Some cabins had collapsed, some families hadn't made it, but Eliza's firebed had stayed warm. Word spread faster than floodwater, and now the whole valley wanted to know, what was it? How did she build it? Could they learn? And Eliza, grief-worn, calloused, soot-smudged Eliza, stood before them, not like a preacher or a prophet, but like a woman who had crawled into the cold and dared to make something warm beneath it. She didn't shout, she didn't boast, she just said, "I'll show you." And she did. One homestead at a time, one trench at a time, one mother's trembling hands at a time. Not everyone believed, not everyone listened, but those who did, they stopped burning their furniture, stopped burying their children, stopped fearing the dark, because they'd seen what could be done with clay and stone, with patience and pain, with fire low and close and wise, and all of it started under one woman's bed. It was the third spring after Joseph's death when the first man tried to buy the secret. He wasn't from the valley, wore a derby hat too stiff for the wind, and had boots that hadn't seen real mud in years, called himself Mr. Talcott, said he was from Denver, rode in on a clean stage with a catalogue under his arm and a folded checkbook he kept fingering like it was a Bible. He didn't ask for tea, didn't look at her children, didn't even remove his gloves before stating his offer. $100 for the design, he said. Eliza didn't move. Her son was tending the coals in the trench. Her daughter was sewing rag patches onto the hem of last year's quilt. Outside, a breeze shook the old cottonwoods, the first real warm wind of the season. The earth was beginning to soften again. Talcott tapped his boot impatiently. You can draw it up. Simple diagram. I'll even write it down myself if you prefer. We'll manufacture them. Proper box inserts. Steel lining. Imported fire brick. The city's full of homes that could use heat like this, real heat from below. He gestured toward the bed without asking, and that was his mistake. Eliza stood slowly. No, she said. He blinked. No diagram, no drawing, no price. Talcott's smile faltered. Ma'am, this is your chance to turn something practical into a real invention. Think of it. Your name attached. A Martin Radiant bed furnace. Think of the patent, the money. But Eliza was already walking to the door. You want warmth? She said. Dig. She didn't slam the door after him, just closed it softly. The wind took care of the rest. That summer, the talk shifted from curiosity to imitation. You could see it in the way new cabins were built. Lower foundations, deeper hearths, angled vents. You could see it in the way boys stopped splitting logs with such haste, in the way men started hauling clay, not just stone. You could see it in how the storekeeper began stocking bricks alongside salt pork and flour. But they never built them quite right. Not unless they had Eliza's hands on the earth. The trench had to be just so. The slope of the tunnel had to carry smoke away without stealing heat. The bedding bricks needed to be thick and porous, not too smooth, or the warmth wouldn't hold. The airflow had to be steady, slow, controlled. Most folks didn't understand that. They wanted hot, not warm. They still thought of fire like a punishment or a dance, not a body to be fed gently, so they kept coming to her, even the preacher. Brother Myron arrived just before the fall frost, his hat in his hands, eyes low. The chapel had nearly burned in July, a lightning strike in the steeple, and the new hearthstone was poor, full of cracks. He said nothing at first, just walked her property line, then back again, then stood near the porch, coughing awkwardly. Eliza came out and leaned on the post, said nothing. Finally, he muttered, "Would you consider helping with the chapel floor? We have 3 elderly in the back pews that near froze last service." She tilted her head. "I thought it was blasphemy." He looked up. "Maybe it was. Or maybe I was just afraid." Eliza stared for a long moment, then turned to the shed. "Bring gloves." And that was that. By the time the snow fell again, half the valley had redug their homes, but not everyone appreciated it. There were old ways, old men, old pride. Some said the earth shouldn't be cracked open like that. Others said the air down there carried bad spirits. Still others called it woman's work. Baking heat like biscuits, not burning it like men ought to. But none of that stopped the quiet march of fire beneath the floorboards. What did stop it, at least for a time, was a death. Not Eliza's, not her children, Rebecca Finch's sister. It wasn't the stove's fault. The girl was sick already. Lung rot, maybe worse. The bed warmth gave her comfort in the end, but it couldn't cure what had already eaten through her from the inside. Still, the moment she died, the whispers began again. "They sleep too close to the fire," someone said. "Those vents carry more than heat," another muttered. "God never meant a bed to burn," a third claimed. It all came back like rot in a root cellar. Eliza heard it. She expected it, but this time, she didn't wait for the storm. She called a meeting. It was held in the old schoolhouse, now used mostly for quilting bees and town votes. She sent word through children and post riders and milk routes. No one was forced to come, but they came anyway. Curiosity, anger, loyalty, fear, all of it packed tight into a low-ceilinged room that still smelled of chalk and soot. Eliza stood at the front. No lectern, no notes, just her hands, calloused and steady. "You all know what I did," she said. "Some of you sleep warm because of it. Some of you still curse me when your fires go out. And now someone's died, and you're looking for blame." Silence. She stepped forward. "I didn't invent anything new. I remembered something old, something the rest of us forgot. Not a spell, not a scheme, just a better way to keep from dying in the dark." Someone near the back grunted. "It ain't natural." Eliza turned to him. "What part of survival ever is?" He didn't answer. She looked over the crowd. "You want me to stop? Fine. Dig your own holes. Make your own mistakes. Let your wives burn their hair trying to choke a chimney with wet logs. Let your babies baby's cry through the frost. I'm done begging anyone to listen. She paused, looked down, then added, quiet as a breath, but don't come to me when the next storm buries your door, because I can't warm every soul in this valley, only those who ask. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, someone stood. Rebecca Finch. She didn't speak, just walked up beside Eliza and laid a small brick on the schoolhouse table, rough, blackened, from her own stove bed. Then Ephraim stood, did the same, then Mabel's husband, then the storekeeper, then a young girl who'd never said a word in public before, tears in her eyes, pressing her father's fire tunnel map into Eliza's hand like it was scripture. By the end, the table was full of bricks. Eliza said nothing. She didn't need to. The next winter came colder than the last. The first week of January, a blizzard hit so sudden and so violent the post routes shut down for 12 days straight. One man froze in his barn. 2 more were found unconscious in a snowdrift between homesteads, saved only because one of them had carved a trench into the hillside and remembered what Eliza taught about low fires and sealed clay. But this time, more were ready. They had beds that radiated like embers. They had homes that held warmth like old hands. And when the snow cleared, they rebuilt faster. Eliza never called it hers, never named it, never claimed invention or legacy, but others did. They began calling it Martin Heat in letters, then the widow's fire. But her daughter called it something else. One night when the coals glowed beneath their bunk and the wind scratched at the shuttered windows like wolves looking for a crack. "Ma," she whispered, "it's like sleeping on the sun." Eliza smiled faintly, brushing a curl from the girl's brow. "No," she said, "not the sun." She placed her palm flat against the floorboard, feeling the warmth creep upward, steady and sure. "It's like sleeping on a promise." That spring, Mr. Talcott came back, this time with a lawyer and blueprints and offers of partnership. He spoke of factories, of domestic thermal systems, of shipping crates and urban basements and Victorian parlors that would pay handsomely to sleep as warm as the wild frontier widow. He called her invention visionary. He called her technique patentable. He called her warmth a revolution. And when he'd finished, when the lawyer had cleared his throat and pointed at the dotted line, Eliza Martin took the pen in hand. She stared at it, then at the children, then at the trench, then she placed the pen down. "I'm not building for parlors," she said. "I'm building for families." The lawyer sighed. Talcott rolled his eyes. "You'll regret this," he said, but she didn't, because by then, warmth wasn't something she needed to sell. It had already spread, and it would keep spreading, not as profit, as memory, as proof that something quiet, buried and strong could keep a soul alive when nothing else would. The thing about heat was, once you felt it in your bones, truly felt it, you never forgot it, you never settled again for less. That was what made Eliza dangerous, not to men like Ephraim or Rebecca Finch, but to men in high collars and polished boots, men who built things for profit, men who said survival came from discipline, not ingenuity, men who controlled the firewood markets, who sold iron stoves from train depots, who told townsfolk that freezing was the price of progress and that any warmth they couldn't tax was a threat to order. It started with letters, not to Eliza but to the townsfolk, nicely worded letters on embossed paper. Concerns about unauthorized heating structures, liability in case of injury, the danger of improper airflow under homes. At first, most people ignored them. No one had gotten sick. No fires had broken out. In fact, the valley had lost fewer people to cold that year than any on record. But the letters kept coming. Then came the man who carried them, Inspector Allerton. He wore a wool coat too clean for frontier mud, and boots that shined even after his third stop. He didn't speak loudly, didn't bark orders. He just asked questions, soft, polite, like he wasn't inspecting so much as inquiring. "How deep is your fire channel, sir? Are you aware that foundation vents are not certified for subfloor combustion? Would you mind if I stepped inside to inspect the thermal gradient?" He smiled a lot, wrote things in a little book, nodded when folks answered. But when he left each house, he marked the lintel with a tiny red chalk slash. Didn't say what it meant. People began to worry, especially when he got to Eliza. She met him at the door, didn't invite him in. He smiled. "Mrs. Martin, I presume?" "Eliza," she said flatly. He tipped his hat. "I've been sent to assess certain heating structures in the region. There's word that you've pioneered an unconventional system." She didn't answer. He glanced past her shoulder. "Might I take a look?" "No." His smile didn't falter. "This is just a precaution, ma'am. If everything's up to code, there'll be no trouble." She crossed her arms. "Whose code?" "Well, the Department of Civil Safety has "This ain't Denver," she said. "We didn't get any help when the blizzards took our livestock. No inspectors came when the well froze. No agents brought wood when our babies cried all night. So unless that little book of yours can chop timber and patch bricks, I suggest you take your chalk and ride back the way you came." For the first time, he blinked. She stepped forward. "You call it unconventional. I call it alive. And I ain't letting a man with soft boots and a feather pen tell me how to keep my children breathing in January." He didn't argue, just closed the book, tipped his hat, and left. But the next day, there was a sign posted on the schoolhouse door. Notice of prohibition. All non-standard heating systems are to be dismantled, pending inspection. Panic spread faster than frost. The townsfolk were split. Some, like Ephraim and Rebecca, stood firm. "Let them come," Ephraim said. "They can't stop us from digging holes in our own land." Rebecca took it further, hosting gatherings to teach women how to build and seal fire trenches with nothing but clay, old stone, and hands worn from laundry. Her house became a quiet forge of resistance. But others buckled. Mabel Dunn's husband tore out their stove bed with a crowbar, said he didn't want to risk fines. "We'll just burn more this year," he told her. She wept silently while he ripped out the bricks. The storekeeper removed the trench kits from his shelves. "Can't sell nothing illegal," he muttered, "even if it's saving lives." Worse still, some folks turned on Eliza. "Why'd you have to open your mouth?" one woman hissed at her in the post office. "You brought eyes we didn't want," said another. Eliza didn't respond. She just kept walking. But when she returned home, she found a nail stuck through her fire vent pipe. Sabotage. Her hands shook when she pulled it free. Not from fear, but from something harder, something older. Resolve. They wanted her quiet, buried, cold. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She didn't rebuild the vent. She built a new one, deeper, better, hidden beneath a false floorboard in the rear. She lined it with scavenged tin, smoothed the edges with fine ash paste, and drew the airflow in a zigzag under the bed to capture every possible flicker of warmth. She taught her daughter how to monitor the drawer with a candle flame, taught her son how to clean it in silence, in case prying eyes ever wandered too close. But she didn't stop there. She took her trench maps and folded them small, fit them into little pockets sewn into shawls, into prayer books, into the lining of sugar sacks. She gave them to those who still believed, quietly, one at a time, like passing secrets between saints. No instructions, just drawings. Those who understood would know what to do. Then, without warning, Inspector Allerton vanished. Some said the stagecoach broke an axle and left him behind. Others said he fell ill and was taken back to the city. Still others whispered that he never made it out at all, that the hills swallowed him up like a storm swallows a lantern. No one asked too many questions. The chalk marks faded in the spring rains, and no new inspectors came, but the damage lingered. People were scared again, not just of the cold, but of being seen, of being too warm when they shouldn't be, of fire that didn't smoke. Eliza felt it in the way they looked at her, grateful but wary, like she'd shown them how to survive but not how to be safe. She stopped hosting visitors, stopped walking to the chapel, kept to her cabin, where the trench glowed faint beneath the bed, and the only warmth that mattered was the kind that held her children while they slept. And for a while, that was enough. Until the girl came. She wasn't from the valley, too thin, too pale, maybe 16, came staggering through the spring mud with nothing but a blanket and a leather satchel that clinked with glass. Eliza saw her through the window, barely standing, eyes wide with something between fever and purpose. Eliza opened the door before she knocked. The girl collapsed into her arms. When she came to, 2 days later, she had a name, May, and a story. Her father had been a railroad cook, Chinese, with stories full of fire and brick and bedstoves like the ones Eliza had built. He'd died 2 winters ago in a tunnel collapse. But before that, he'd taught her everything he could. Taught her how to trap heat in clay, how to root smoke like water, how to build warmth that didn't rise but wrapped around you like a prayer. She'd heard stories, far out west in Sacramento, of a woman building kang beds in a valley that wasn't supposed to know such things. She'd walked 3 weeks to find her. When Eliza asked why, May answered without hesitation, "Because this doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to anyone with hands and cold nights." And just like that, the loneliness Eliza hadn't admitted to in years cracked. They worked together all that summer, quietly, relentlessly. They refined the designs, narrower channels, more efficient stonework. They built beds for the sick, for the elderly, for the forgotten. They repaired the ones torn out in fear. May taught Eliza how to read smoke the way others read wind. Eliza taught May how to hear the creek's call for clay when it was just right for sealing. And in that unlikely sisterhood, something stronger than fire took root. Not invention, not rebellion, continuance. They never gave it a name, not one that stuck. People tried the widow's flame, the Chinese bed, Martin May furnace. But those who used it didn't call it anything at all. They just slept warm, burned less, and when the snows came back, they built in silence, dug low, sealed tight, shared bricks and ash paste like bread, whispered the trench depth to their neighbors over fence lines, watched their children sleep without shivering. They didn't light torches, didn't write slogans, they just endured, together. Eliza grew older. Her hands stiffened. Her knees ached when she knelt by the trench, but the warmth never left. And when she finally lay down for the last time, years later in a bed still warm from fire beneath, the valley did not hold a funeral with speeches or sermons. Instead, they dug. Every house, every homestead. They dug new trenches, replaced bricks, passed on drawings, sealed the earth like she taught them. And when her daughter lit the fire that night, beneath the bed where her mother used to sleep, she whispered one word. "Thank you." The flame did not roar. It pulsed, soft, steady, a warmth that would not be bought, buried, or broken, a warmth that held. When the valley spoke of Eliza Martin in the years that followed, they did not speak of her face. They spoke of the floor. They spoke of the way the warmth soaked into your knees when you knelt to pray or pulled off your boots after a frost-choked walk from the barn. They spoke of the hush in a home without smoke, no roaring flames, no creaking chimneys, just the hush of a low, living warmth that made the walls breathe soft as an old lullaby. No monument was ever carved for her, no statue raised. But ask a mother whose firewood ran out 3 days before the first wagon could make it up the pass. She'd point to the trench beneath her bed and say, that was hers. Ask a widow who lost her husband in the same storm that took 2 of her fingers. She'd run her hand over the smooth fire brick near the porch vent and whisper, she showed me how. Ask the boy, now grown, who once laid fevered beside Eliza's own children. He'd tell you the warmth saved more than his body. It saved his heart. Because to survive in that kind of cold, you needed more than timber and stone. You needed something to believe in. And that's what Eliza built, without meaning to. The years softened the memory. Like heat bleeding gently into old boards. May stayed for a time, long enough to carry the knowledge further. She rode south with a trader's family the following year, bringing her father's satchel, her own drawings, and a promise to teach where it was most needed. Before she left, she carved a single word into the frame of Eliza's door, so small no one noticed for years. Heng Nuan. It meant enduring warmth. No one knew how to say it but her. But that didn't matter. The warmth endured anyway. Seasons turned. Cabins came and went. The valley's name appeared in travel guides and faded again. Rail lines reached it, then bypassed it. Some of the old trench beds were replaced by cast iron heaters. Some collapsed under careless boots. Some were sealed with concrete during a generation that thought electricity would solve everything. But not all. In the low cabins, in the hard winters, in the quiet places where heat still mattered more than fashion, the beds remained, the trenches remained. The children, now old, still showed others how to build them, not for money, not for credit, but because it was right, because someone once knelt in the cold and made fire stay. And in the dim corners of barns and root cellars, old bricks could still be found with soot stains in odd places and faint carvings worn down by decades of barefoot steps. The marks were simple: circles, arrows, sun lines. Some said they were instructions, others said they were prayers. Either way, they worked. It was over 20 years before a stranger came again, asking about Eliza. This one was a young man from the east, smart glasses, nervous smile, leather-bound notebook full of measurements and ideas. He'd heard of the trench beds from a half-written letter in a university archive, tracked the rumor to the valley, said he wanted to study thermal efficiencies in frontier heating systems. The townsfolk just shrugged. Most didn't remember much. Others remembered too well and wouldn't say a word. But one old woman, Rebecca Finch, now grey and slow, still sharp, led him to the old Martin place. The cabin was long abandoned. The roof had sagged in. Moss grew along the seams. But the bed trench was still there, just beneath the collapsed frame, perfectly dry, the fire brick sealed tight by the kind of clay you couldn't buy anymore. The young man took notes, photographed it, spoke to Rebecca for hours. Then he asked her, as the sun sank low behind the hills, "Do you know what it was called? The design? The system?" Rebecca leaned on her cane, looked long at the ground where Eliza had once stood, one hand on the doorframe, watching the wind. "She never gave it a name," she said. "Everyone else tried, but she didn't want her name on it. She didn't want to be remembered for inventing something. She wanted people to stay alive." The man looked puzzled. "But don't you think she deserves to be known?" Rebecca smiled faintly. "She's known where it matters, and that was the last thing she said before turning back toward town, leaving the man alone with the trench and the wind and a warmth he couldn't feel, but somehow understood. That winter, the man published an article, not in a major journal, not in a flashy magazine, just a quiet piece in a back-end engineering quarterly, titled The Bed That Burned From Below, a Forgotten Frontier Solution. It featured no diagrams, just stories, and in the final paragraph he wrote, "There is no patent, no blueprint, only mud and brick and memory. But in a forgotten valley where the cold once ruled, there are still homes that burn low and stay warm, and at the center of them all was a widow who, when the world went silent, dug into the earth and said, 'Not my children, not this time.' In time, other valleys heard. Old ideas resurfaced in new mouths. Bedstove trenching, passive ground heating, low flame radiance. The names didn't matter. What mattered was that the principle survived. And it survived not because of industry, not because of wealth, but because of one woman's refusal to freeze, because of the frost on her husband's beard, and the night she fed her children soup with fingers too stiff to hold the ladle, because of the day she dug bare-handed through floorboards until her knuckles bled, because of the moment she understood that warmth didn't need to roar, it just needed to last. Somewhere, high in the ridgeline of that same valley, there is a stone tucked under a pine. No name, no date, just a flat rock, set deliberately, with a strange warmth to it, even in snow, and under it, a space, small, sealed. Within, a folded sheet of paper, old, fragile, still legible. It reads, "Dig shallow, line with brick, seal with ash paste, feed fire slow, let warmth linger, use what you have, build for those you love, sleep warm, wake alive." There is no signature, but none is needed, because everyone in the valley knows who wrote it. And if you knock the snow from your boots and step into any of the older homes when the wind is howling and the wood piles run low, you'll find it there, under the bed, a heat that doesn't boast, a flame you cannot see, but it holds and always will.